Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we'll be talking through the headlines with the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood and the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, Sophia Gaston. So welcome to you two. So let's take a check then on what's making the front pages of the Sunday papers. And Boris Johnson wants to replace a series of top civil servants in a bid to dramatically change the approach taken in some of Whitehall's most influential departments. That's according to the Daily Telegraph. In The Observer, Keir Starmer warns Labour members that the party could be locked out of power for a generation if it doesn't stop infighting. The Sunday Express says Downing Street has mocked the European Union for behaviour it calls divided and distracted in the run-up to Brexit trade talks. And the Sunday Mirror reports that Portuguese police have questioned a British barmaid about her ex-boyfriend in relation to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The boyfriend said he knew nothing about the missing toddler. So Tom Harwood and Sophia Gaston here with me. Paper's still coming in, of course, but let's go through your selection so far. And front page of the Sunday Telegraph is the paper you've picked out first of all, and their headline is all about civil servants and whether or not they're going to hang on to their jobs, essentially, isn't it?
I mean, this is clearly Dominic Cummings' revolution, sort of Mark II. Things are continuing apace. I just find the language here so unnecessarily hostile, the whole framing of this. I mean, it's one thing to sort of want to come in and shake things up, but, you know, we need to remember that our civil service is one of the best in the world. It really is something we should be proud of. And, I mean, anybody who thinks that a culture of fear is going to inspire productive output, I think is just killing themselves.
So take us through some of the details here, Tom. The suggestion is that a number of these mandarins, as they call them, are potentially on a list of people that might be replaced. What's the thinking behind that? Is it because they suspect they aren't sympathetic to what the government wants to do, or is it part of a different kind of shake-up?
So the Sunday Telegraph is reporting that senior Tories have drawn up what they call an S-word list of the top bad actors within the civil service.
Thank you for not using the actual word.
It took a great deal of restraint. But this list comprises people who the government don't see as being on board with the agenda of this government, who are going to be obstructing rather than helping deliver that sort of agenda, and it includes people in the Treasury, people in the Home Office. We've heard a lot about the Home Office, and there's a big battle brewing there, particularly with Priti Patel's frustration over the inability to arrest, for example, Extinction Rebellion protesters breaking the law. There's a lot of these roadblocks to progress as the government see it, and they want to be able to make sure that there's a much more streamlined system, that there aren't those roadblocks in the way, and that things can actually get done. And this has been a long-term passion project for a lot of the people who are now running the show in Number 10.
I mean, it's just absurd to even frame civil servants as needing to be on the government's agenda. The entire point of the civil service is that it provides frank and fearless advice. We need them as a sort of sounding board there. They've got the evidence, they're doing the research, they present options to ministers. Obviously, ministers take the decisions, they're the elected representatives. But the idea that you would want a civil service that is all on board with the government's agenda, I just think the policy outcomes would be worse.
Well, that's right, the checks and balances, do you think?
Sure, yeah, but there's a difference between offering advice and then being an effective obstacle. And I think that it was Margaret Thatcher who always said the best TV show, documentary, whatever, about British politics was Yes, Minister, that show that focuses on how civil servants try and manipulate their ministers and force through things and really obstruct change. And it is important when a country is embarking on a great moment of national renewal, as the government sees it, as this huge point of change. It's important that the people who are delivering that believe in that change and aren't going to be sort of getting in the way of that.
Do you think that's fair, that they could be seen as being deliberately obstructive?
I mean, civil servants are, by their very name and nature, they are also public servants. This idea that you have these elected representatives who are somehow on the side of the people and that these civil servants are sort of serving themselves or serving some other kind of motivation. The idea that we would want to inject ideology or an agenda into the civil service. I mean, many of these people have been working for a very long time under successive administrations, under different types of leadership. And, we want people who can stay as career civil servants, who can devote themselves tirelessly and without fear or favour to the cause, which is to serve the British people.
That's entirely right, and I don't disagree with a word that you've said. And the point here is that Number 10 are in favour of the vast majority of the civil service that want to get on, that don't want to be obstructing, that want to keep ideology out of this. The problem is, and the problem actors that have been identified in the S-word list, are those that do have an ideology and those that do want to sort of get in the way or are not on board with the government's agenda. And that's a problem. The problem is those who are trying to bring in their own personal opinions to this, rather than those who are being an impartial civil servant, as the majority of the civil service are. And it's important that the government, or what the Telegraph is reporting that the government is doing, is picking out these bad apples rather than casting aspersions on the whole service.
OK, and it'd be very interesting to see what those individuals would say about it. Unlikely to put their heads above the parapet, one imagines. But let's move on to... you've got a couple of stories that kind of relate to Britain's relationship with America, don't they? So to start off with, there's one inside the Mail on Sunday that you found. This is page 7. In fact, it's a series of pages, isn't it? This is page 7, and then you've got a double-page spread coming after this one. But this relates to extradition, doesn't it? And the case of Julian Assange, which has now been linked to that of Harry Dunn by his family.
Well, it's an incredibly sad situation. Obviously, Harry Dunn's family is feeling increasingly desperate. I think certainly since the revelations have come out that Anne Sekulis potentially was actually a CIA agent herself, although not on duty at the time of the killing. That still hasn't been all officially confirmed, of course, but I think those revelations must have really struck the family as a sense of just helplessness came over them. I think any idea that she would be extradited once that information had come to hand, I think it just must have been a fading kind of window of opportunity. So this is a real act of desperation to try and find a way to create almost a quid pro quo, but unfortunately it's just not how the system works.
And she's wanted, of course, over the killing of Harry Dunn in a road accident in the UK. The US is not extraditing her. The family have said tonight that they want Britain to say, well, we won't send Julian Assange, who is wanted in America, we won't extradite him until you send her over. That's what the family is suggesting that the British government do.
That's right. And that's what the headline in the Mail on Sunday is saying. It poses it as a question. Will Britain refuse to send Assange to the US until they hand over Harry Killer? However, when you see a title like that in a paper that's posed as a question, the answer is almost always no. And the extradition relationship between the UK and the US is, unfortunately, has been for many, many years deeply, deeply imbalanced. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot of light at the end of this tunnel.
Many more people go from Britain to America than come back the other way, is what you mean by unbalanced, don't you? Let's move on to the other story that relates to Britain's relationship with America, and this is over Huawei.
Yeah, and actually it's funny because there are so many commentators and politicians in this country who are saying that Boris is so subservient to Trump, he's just doing the US's bidding, that once Britain has left the European Union, it will be just following what America does. Well, actually, this Huawei decision is a massive rebuke to that refrain, because ultimately Number 10 has struck its own path here. It did not follow the heavy pressure that the US was putting on this government. And now the US is saying that perhaps it will step back the amount of data that it shares with the UK over nuclear projects, over classified security information because of this decision to move ahead with Huawei to create our 5G network.
And we see there's an article there by David Davis, former Brexit secretary, about this, saying the most devastating security blunder since MI6 hired Philby, Blunt and Burgess, he says. So, I mean, there are mixed feelings about that decision. What do you make of the move and the impact it could have on future relations with the US?
Well, I think it's important to remember as well that the anger's not just coming from the United States, it's also coming from Australia. And we know there have been some very significant blow-ups behind the scenes with the sort of diplomatic corps and the different civil servants there. There was meant to be a big expedition of the Australian Security Select Committee was meant to be coming over to Britain. That trip has been cancelled. So there is a much broader climate here. I mean, the United States and Australia are two of our most important allies, and not just conceptually, philosophically, special relationships. These often sound quite nebulous. These are our most important intelligence partners. And I think this is an ongoing conversation. We had Michael Pompeo, Secretary of State from the US, came out a couple of weeks ago when things were very tense. We saw him and Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, together at an event, sort of making peace, smoothing things over. I think at a political level, both Trump and Johnson understand that it's not in either of their interests really to be at loggerheads. That special relationship is something that is valued by the people of Britain and the people of the United States. It is an election year for Mr. Trump. But I think it's quite clear that this conversation has not run its course and that both the Americans and the Australians will be trying to lobby right up until the bitter end.
So we haven't heard the last of it.
No, but that being said, it was not an easy decision for Number 10. Number 10 were almost begging the United States to offer another option. If there was another option to quickly build 5G in this country, Number 10 would have jumped at that opportunity. But the reality is the companies simply don't exist. So the challenge, I think, over the next few years is making sure there is that competitor for Huawei in the West that simply doesn't exist right now.
OK, one to continue to watch. Talking of watching, let's move on to a story inside the Sunday Express. And this is a debate that has been rolling on for days now, hasn't it? And over the future funding of the BBC.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's almost the sort of whispering that has been going on in right-wing circles for years, if not decades, has now burst out into the open, and it seems to be the mainstream position of the government, of many people in Parliament, of a lot of the commentariat now that the current model of funding the BBC in this country has run its course. It might have made sense back when people had one little TV set in one room of the house, but the way that people watch and consume TV and the way that it's not now just left to one national broadcaster, the licence fee simply does not make any sense anymore.
OK, you think that's now a common view. Do you think that's right? Do you think people think that the funding should be changed in some way?
Well, I mean, this story is actually showing the results of a public opinion poll, a survey undertaken by Comres. I mean, if you ask people, do you want to pay for something, it is very rare that they're going to say yes. But I don't think that that is completely separate to people also recognising its value. We can see here that nearly 2/3 of the population do believe that the BBC is an important part of British culture. And I think it's really important to separate the motivations here. There are people who are making the case, and I think it's fair to say that, you know, the BBC needs to think about how it evolves into the digital age, and it hasn't always been particularly successful. The media landscape is very different now, and I think that is a reasonable conversation to have. But there's also a very strong air of ideology here coming. There are people who simply have it in for the BBC. There are people who think that it's somehow partisan and sort of part of some kind of left or right-wing conspiracy. And I just think that we need to separate those motivations in the conversation. There are definitely tough decisions that need to be made for the BBC, but it does, as well as being an important part of our culture, it's an important part of our democracy, and we have to think very carefully before we tinker with that.
And it is true that different papers have for a long time taken different positions on the BBC, haven't they?
That's very true. It does, however, feel like a bit of a moment now that people are so openly saying that this should happen, and that actually it was something that was spontaneously coming up during the election campaign. Nicky Morgan gave an interview a couple of weeks ago whereby she was saying it was coming up on the doorstep, even, the issue of the licence fee. And it's clear, I think I totally agree with you, people value the BBC as a brand, as an international brand, but that doesn't mean that they think that the licence fee is an acceptable model in the 21st century. In many ways, the licence fee, if it were to continue as it currently does, would be the death knell for the BBC, because no one is really consuming TV going into the future in the same way that they have been doing for the past 50 years or so. So really, in order to save and protect a national broadcaster, there needs to be a different private model of funding.
And as you know, the BBC takes a very different view to that. We will take a break there. Plenty more to discuss coming up, though, including why Downing Street has issued the EU a warning ahead of trade talks. We're going to be discussing that after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood and the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, Sophia Gaston. And we've just got the Sunday Times front page in, so I'm just going to show everybody because it's the first time we've seen it. Their headline is House of Lords expenses spiral out of control, and they say that money claimed by peers has risen 29% in just 1 year. I'm not going to quiz you on that because I know that you haven't even looked at it, but we may return to that when you come back at 11:30, but just so that you're up to date with the latest front page we've got. You do want to talk about the front page of the Express and the story inside as well. The headline is EU are divided and distracted. What are they distracted by?
Well, this is a total turning of the tables from what we saw over the last 3 years when Britain was internally divided, had inconclusive election results, was squabbling over what was going to happen. Now it looks like the UK is really clear in its ask, and the EU is actually facing a lot of internal pressure. We've had, particularly the election result in Ireland was very destabilising, and similarly there's now a big row over the budget within the European Union. Obviously the UK leaving means one of the biggest cash cows for the club has gone, and there is now a huge amount of rancour and indecision and battling over that issue within the European Union, and that undermines their sort of unity of purpose and strength in negotiations.
And let's take a look at the double-page spread inside, which goes further on this story. Europe's leaders on edge of chaos. Do you think that's right, or do they always wrangle about budgets?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this story, even trying to link these budget negotiations with the Brexit negotiations is a little bit facetious. The EU's budget negotiations are always historically complicated, fractious, fraught. It's always very much a last-minute situation of coming together at the 11th hour. That's how the EU likes to do things. And every budget negotiation has been very difficult.
But there is the added complication of the fact that they haven't got Britain's money anymore, so that does put extra pressure on, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and it's also true that these budgets are looking ahead to 5 years from now, and obviously in the past 5 years Europe has changed dramatically, and the big issues on its plate have really shifted. I mean, there is a call here for more money for border protection, for example. That's in response to the migration crisis in 2015, 2016. Climate change is now top of the agenda for EU leaders, so there's different countries wanting to lobby for money for that. I think these budgetary pressures are real, and obviously the departure of the UK does turn up the heat a little bit. But the idea that Europe is somehow divided in a way it's never been before, I think is a bit of a stretch.
There is a difference, though, and that is that now this is happening in the middle of what is going to be a very short and hot negotiation.
And I'm going to bring in the next article quick because we only got a minute. Do carry
exactly.
on. But this is inside the Mail.
This fits in so nicely because the chief Brexit negotiator for Number 10, David Frost, has written for the Mail, basically reiterating his speech that he gave in Brussels on Monday, saying that the whole point of Brexit is regulatory divergence. If the EU is not going to envisage a deal in the same way that it envisaged with Canada or with Japan that allows the country that they do a deal with to do things differently domestically, then there's no deal to be done, because unless you can do things differently after Brexit, there's no point in Brexiting at all.
And what do you make of David Frost coming out and saying this now?
Well, it's all about Canada, isn't it? And I think one thing we always have to remember is Canada's biggest trading partner is not the EU, it's actually the United States. That is because of geography. And who's at our doorstep? Our biggest trading partner, Europe. Canada has a much closer trading relationship with the United States than we would be looking to pursue with the European Union under this kind of plan. And I think that should raise alarm.
But Canada doesn't accept American laws. That's the fundamental difference. It's an independent country, and so should we be.
OK. I suspect we'll return to this, but we must leave it for now. Sophia and Tom, for the moment, thank you. See you at 11:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Tom Harwood and Sophia Gaston here with me tonight. Lots of different front pages around with very different stories. So let's start with the Sunday Times. You wanted to talk about their, they call it their investigation, their analysis of peers' expenses.
Yeah, this is the extraordinary news that the amount of money that we're throwing at the House of Lords has increased by 29% in just 1 year. And this includes people who most people would reasonably say aren't doing very much and are claiming an extraordinary amount of money. There's one Labour peer in this who spoke in just 17 debates, just 17 floor speeches, very short, member of no committees, and claimed £80,000 of taxpayers' money. This is clearly a system that is spiralling out of control, where people aren't doing very much and are claiming a huge amount of money. There are billionaires in the House of Lords that are claiming tens of thousands of pounds from hard-working taxpayers every single year. And it's wrong. And I think that this is a government that wants to fix these constitutional issues. And perhaps this is the start of a conversation about how we change some of these anachronistic institutions of our country. That being said, it seems that this is not going to be dealt with quickly as the size of the House of Lords continues to grow. It looks like the new intake list of peers will be another 39 this year, really growing that House even larger, to the point where the UK, already the second largest parliament or legislature in the world, is getting ever closer to the size of the Chinese legislature. And that's just a crazy state for a country of 67 million people.
And clearly we don't have the peers' explanations of why these expense claims have been made. Perhaps we'll hear about those in days to come. But do they, on the face of it, does this kind of increase sound like it's out of control, as the Sunday Times describes it in their headline?
Well, I mean, I personally value the work that the House of Lords do. I think they're incredibly important to our democracy. The second reading, the scrutiny, the select committees, it's all really important stuff. So I don't think we should just sort of dismiss this as kind of lazy fat cats. But that said, the work is clearly very uneven, the participation is uneven, and that's something that I think we will necessarily see some more scrutiny on. We know that Boris Johnson has been a long-standing critic of the size of the House of Lords, so we can expect some movement in that direction. That said, I think there's a rather important paragraph towards the end which does note that, Johnson himself is expected to swell the ranks of the Lords, as every single Prime Minister has said for some time, we need to get these numbers down, we need to get these numbers down. At the end of the day, the political imperative to have their men and women, on the red benches always seems to prevail.
Although this is the first time in a very long time that the party that has a majority in the House of Commons has a substantial minority in the House of Lords. So perhaps that imbalance will finally be the impetus to some sort of reform.
Well, yes, and we're talking about, when you say that they swell to huge numbers, we're talking about over 800 people, aren't we?
It's quite extraordinary, and obviously Tony Blair brought in some reforms to try and reduce the number of hereditary peers. That was the last time we saw a big cut to the numbers. Since then, it's been back to this horse race of Labour leaving government, nominating a bunch of people to keep their sort of men and women, and give their nods to the people who've served them well. Where obviously Conservatives have been in power now for a decade, so we're seeing a lot of their folk come in. So, I mean, there are a number of questions here about the participation, the functioning, there's the claiming of the expenses, there's also the nomination process. And I think this was something that under Theresa May, there were some rather big questions being asked. She had said she wanted to clean it up and improve transparency. And then we saw an enormous number of sort of special advisors and donors and so on given their nod and bumped into the red benches. And I think that this is the sort of thing that breeds public mistrust.
And of course, just quickly, readers of the Guido Fawkes website will have read last week that the new list is expected to be 39 new peers. So that's the largest increase of the House of Lords for many, many years.
OK, let's move on to another issue inside at the Mail on Sunday tomorrow. And this is a statement that was issued by Harry and Meghan in response to them not being allowed to use the term royal.
I mean, things are clearly deteriorating. There was a very amicable statement, obviously, after they had that summit in Sandringham, and then Harry and Meghan sort of were off quite swiftly, but there was a very heartfelt and meaningful statement then. But I think what we're starting to see is that there were a lot of the particulars, a lot of the details had not actually been worked out at that time. And this is where the real battles of the negotiations are taking place. And clearly, this is a commercial question. Obviously, Harry and Meghan had been seeking to capitalise on their royal backgrounds by using this kind of language. The Queen and the Palace have obviously come back and said, no, we have to draw a line. it's really getting into a tit for tat now. But I think it is very sad, really. This is a family who's clearly sort of pulling apart. This is not just a business negotiation. This is the coming apart of an institution, and which has a family at its heart.
Do you think that they did want to use this kind of branding for commercialisation, or some have suggested, their supporters have suggested, it was to prevent others exploiting the brand so they could kind of own it, if you like?
I don't think that's quite how the statement reads, really. It's quite extraordinary how explicit they've been, really opening up what were private negotiations, saying that, oh, if we wanted, we could use this brand outside the jurisdiction of the UK, particularly in the American market. Now, that's something that's incredibly unbecoming of people who are supposed to be at the top of the royal family. It's almost like Harry and Meghan want to have all of the perks of being a royal, all of the fame and the adoration, but with none of the drawbacks and none of the duties. And that is a problem. That is not the way that the world works. You can't have your cake and eat it. And that's what they want to do. And it's really sad that they've had to put the Queen in this position. It's deeply, deeply wrong, really.
Do you think that's right, or do you think that the statement, interpreted by some as being perhaps sounding a bit upset or self-justificatory, but do you think it's, to some extent, if that is a word, I'm not sure if it is, do you think to a certain extent they do want to say this is what we were trying to do, we're trying to explain ourselves rather than be hostile?
I think, and I mean, look at this extraordinary piece we have to the side here. I fear she's put a sliver of ice in Harry's heart. I mean, this has been the tone of so much of the reporting, and I do really, I did very much sympathise with Harry and Meghan having really come to the end of their tether. I think when they took the decision to break away, it was a moment of deep vulnerability, and they were reacting to a very hostile media environment, and it just didn't feel that their mental health could stand up to this kind of scrutiny. And I think that we need to have sympathy for that. What's happening here is that we're having what are very intimate family matters couched in an institution that we all feel is our own, but with very particular commercial, legal negotiations happening as well at the same time. And it's just a really complex and convoluted situation. And it's very difficult to think of any kind of precedent for this. It is extraordinary. And I think it is very sad that this family has come to this point.
Well, yes, and they might say, well, we're not going to get a sympathetic reaction to a statement in the newspapers when relations between them and the press have become quite strained.
Well, it's funny, if this was about running away from the press and living a private life, they wouldn't have set up exclusive interviews in the United States. They were running towards the media. They're not trying to hide away from it. It's just they want the media to report them in a particular way.
Or a fair way, they would say.
It seems deeply inconsistent. These are people who, they have a bit, basically their only job as a royal is to be sort of a public face, a public family, and yet they hide away their baby when they have it. That's not what Will and Kate did. That's not what royals do. And fair enough, if they don't want that royal life, then they shouldn't try and exploit the royal brands for financial gain. It's a simple either or. Either you're a royal or you're not. You can't have a halfway house.
OK, let's move on to a completely different issue, the Labour leadership race, and that features on the front page of The Observer.
Well, I mean, the most extraordinary thing is that we've still got, more than a month left to go of this.
April the 4th, is that the right date?
Seasons are changing.
Sounds like it should be April the 1st, really, the way that it's
clocks are going forward and back, and we're still in the Labour leadership. It is going along at a plodding pace. It's interesting because there was a thought originally that extending the length of the campaign was actually good for other candidates. It was going to help diversify the field because, of course, Rebecca Long-Bailey, she was the sort of heir appointed to succeed Corbyn, and there was a sense that if we sort of draw it out longer, then others have a better chance to prove themselves. I think we're sort of at a point where no one's really got anything else to say. It's more a question of the powers of attrition. Will people be making slip-ups and gaffes and so on the campaign trail as they continue to face this level of scrutiny?
Well, that's right, and this is, sorry to dive in there, Tom, but this is an interview that Keir Starmer has given to The Observer. The headline is that he's warning Labour, we've got to come together or we're going to be out of power. And is there a sense that the timing now is crucial because ballots start going out on Monday? And do you think because this race as you see it, has gone on a long time, that people have made their minds up and they may actually vote quite early. So the time is now to get their word.
Yeah, basically that's all it... This piece is deeply boring. This is Keir Starmer trying to make sure there's no excitement left in the race, trying to make sure everyone is bored to tears with the whole thing because he's miles ahead in constituency Labour Party nominations, in the polls, in everything. He wants there to be no more events. And that's why he's talking in bland, generalising terms in this interview and beyond. He's trying to have it sewn up. And I think the way that this has been run by the Labour Party is just so desperately incompetent. If you're going to have a long race, it sort of makes sense, have that broader discussion. Why then did they have the nominations close so early within the parliamentary party, meaning that people scraped onto the ballot and that guillotine came down quite early, so we had our final stage of the race being the protracted bit. Really, if there was going to be a long race, the early stage should have been the long bit, not the late stage. So we just are sitting in this peculiar situation, really, where nothing new is being said, where we're just hearing the same arguments again and again and again about how brilliant the last manifesto was, the manifesto that led to the worst defeat since 1935. There is no substantial policy difference between the top three contenders for this race. They're all trying to present themselves as the heir to Corbynism, just not the heir to Jeremy Corbyn. And they're trying to present themselves as just in a better suit, in a better package, and it's just desperately dull. We're all sick of it.
I think there is an important message to this piece, which is that we fundamentally have not had a functioning opposition in the United Kingdom, really, for 3 or 4 years now. We've had a very strange leader and a strange sort of style of leadership in the Labour Party at a really critical moment in our nation's history. And certainly, I think Keir's point here, it's time to sort of move things on because the country needs a functioning opposition. We're starting these big trade negotiations. There's this levelling up agenda and so on. Obviously, Boris Johnson now has an enormous majority. But, you know, the Labour Party really needs to get its act together. I mean, this is a point for the future of our democracy.
OK, we are going to take a break right there. Plenty more to discuss after the break, including the PM's vanishing briefs, why aides have been ordered to send Boris Johnson shorter memos. That's coming up after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, the Guido Fawkes reporter, Tom Harwood, and the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, Sophia Gaston. And we're going to go back to the front page of the Sunday Times, but it's another story down here called The PM's Vanishing Briefs. It's an intriguing headline. What does it tell us?
There's a lot going on in here.
Yeah.
This is essentially a preview to Tim Shipman's big double-page spread.
Editor, exactly.
Later in the paper. So there's lots going on here. We've got the start of the story is that Boris Johnson's aides have been told that they must send him very succinct 2-page briefs that are very concise and to the point, and then we move on into a range of other different stories about
What's the reason that they say? I know you haven't got many paragraphs to go on here, but what was the reason for the shorter briefs?
Well, there's a source who says here that apparently he will not read them if they're too long, that all the reading that they were given for his weekend away working, that it had to be readable and light and sort of captivating. And obviously the framing here is making reference as well to something that we know very clearly about President Trump, which is that he needs to receive information in this very succinct type of way. So I think they're sort of trying to draw parallels here. I'm not necessarily in agreement that this is, but it's a different type of leadership. And we know that Theresa May, for example, was the sort of person who would read everything. She was across the detail. But here, this seems to suggest that Boris Johnson is more, he wants the high-level information and he'll let others do the hard slog.
And this speaks to the two different styles of prime ministers that we've really had over the last 30 years. You have the sort of Tony Blairs, who are the sort of managerial chairman of the board style prime ministers, who will not go into the particular detail, but will set the sort of direction of the policy. And then you have the sort of Gordon Browns and Theresa Mays, who want absolutely everything in front of them. They want to read every jot and tittle of every little briefing note that comes before them. And actually, broadly, I think the prime ministers who are considered to be more generally successful aren't those that get bogged down in the detail. They're the people that can have a comprehensive overview of everything, rather than getting stuck in these little things. And I'm not sure that the comparison to Trump really works, given that Boris Johnson is someone who can sort of recite the Iliad in ancient Greek from memory. I don't think he's afraid of long words, but it is that difference in style. It's almost a Reagan style as well as a Blair style.
Very quick word on that. Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off mid-sentence, but what do you make of that prime ministers don't necessarily need to get bogged down in too much detail?
Well, I think, look, there's obviously briefing that's coming here from civil servants. Now, there are some civil servants who I'm sure cannot help themselves but be writing 10 to 15-page briefs. Whether or not they could do that more succinctly, I'm sure in certain circumstances they can. I think it's important for prime ministers to be across the detail, and we do want prime ministers to be taking their job very seriously, but I don't think that they necessarily need to be the person who is sort of, down there with the shovel in the weeds of page 13.
OK, let's move on to a story inside the Sunday Express. No doubt it's picked up elsewhere as well, because a lot of the newspapers have their strong views on the future funding of the BBC, and the Sunday Express is delving into this issue themselves.
Yeah, and this is the interesting sort of new angle to the BBC story. Very often you will hear sort of BBC bashing, cancel the licence fee, end the BBC, as if that's all sort of one block. This story is saying, actually, people do value the BBC. They think it's an important national institution, but also they don't like the licence fee. It's a bad way of funding it. And those are not positions that are necessarily opposed to one another. They can sit perfectly consistently. In many ways, actually, the way the surefire death knell for the BBC would be continuing with a licence fee that fewer and fewer people are paying as people move online and away from analogue TV. And actually, the way to preserve institutions like the BBC is to keep them competitive, make them operate more like businesses and less like arms of the state.
And yet the BBC would say, if we don't carry on with the licence fee, we'll lose all sorts of channels. You won't get the BBC that you have now, and you'll miss it.
What's so interesting about this story is that it's focusing on a public opinion survey that's just been published for the Sunday Express in this paper. And what's fascinating about that is we start to get a glimpse into the disparities between the sort of Westminster and Twitter conversation and the conversations that are being had amongst ordinary Britons. I don't think everyday people were, have spent the last 10, 20 years sitting around thinking, gosh, we really need to reform the BBC and scrap the licence fee. It's been a hobby project, something there's been a huge amount of obsession over in Westminster and Twitter. Here we see, for example, this charge that's frequently levelled at the BBC from both the right and the left on social media and so on, that it's biased, it's too right-wing, it's too left-wing. Everyone thinks it's on the other side. This polling is interesting because it shows that the British people in general aren't that interested in that kind of accusation, and actually both think that, it's equally balanced as to whether or not people think it's too far to the left or the right.
OK.
It might be that it's just doing the right job.
I know. We'll come back another time, both of you, and we'll continue that discussion another time. But I'm afraid we are out of time for now. Sophia and Tom, good to see you, though. Thanks very much.
Thank you.